The boss's son returns after years studying abroad, and upon meeting the new black employee, he insults and ridicules her solely for her skin color and humble job. But when his father finds out, he does this. Susan was born in a small town in the countryside, a place with dirt roads and wooden houses. Her childhood was marked by simplicity, among fields of corn and beans. Her parents, dedicated farmers, worked from dawn until dusk, extracting from the soil what was necessary for the family's subsistence. From an early age, Susan learned the value of hard work and the harshness of rural life, where even rain was uncertain and could determine whether there would be food on the table. The young girl grew up watching her parents' calloused hands and listening to stories of others who had left for the big city in search of a better life. Even as a girl, Susan carried dreams larger than the limits of her small town. There was in her a flame of ambition and a clear awareness of the limitations imposed by poverty. The local school, with scarce resources and seldom present teachers, barely offered the basics of education. Even so, Susan stood out, showing a genuine interest in learning more than the old books could teach. She saw education as the key to a different future, even though she knew her parents could not afford the costs of higher studies. Determined not to be another among so many young girls who accepted the fate of marrying young and continuing the life of a farmer, Susan began to save her earnings to leave in search of something beyond the barren landscape she knew so well. When Susan finally came of age, her decision to move to the big city was painful but inevitable. With a small suitcase in hand and a heart full of uncertainties, she said goodbye to her parents at the front door, amidst tears and long hugs. She promised them she would send money as soon as she found a job and that one day she would return to improve their lives. The journey to the city was long and tiring, but Susan's eyes reflected the determination of someone who could not afford to fail. Upon arriving at her destination, she found herself surrounded by tall buildings and busy avenues, a stark contrast to the landscape she had left behind. Life in the city, however, was not easy. Without money, Susan had to sleep in shelters and search for work day and night. People hurried past her, indifferent, and the doors that opened seemed to close again as soon as they saw her modest appearance and country accent. She faced looks of disdain and constant rejections, but she did not give up. Her persistence was driven by the memory of her parents, who depended on her success for a better future. With each refusal, Susan became more determined, convinced that somewhere, an opportunity was waiting for her. After weeks of searching and many moments of despair, Susan finally found a job as a housekeeper in the home of Charles, a successful businessman who seemed different from the other bosses she had known. Charles's house was not very large, but the walls were well decorated with paintings by famous artists and furniture that exuded wealth. For Susan, this job meant more than a salary. It was the first concrete hope of changing her story and honoring the promise she had made to her parents before leaving. Susan's life in Charles's home was full of work, but at the same time, it brought a strange sense of stability. Her routine began before dawn and ended only when night had already set in. Cleaning the rooms, polishing the elegant furniture, and ensuring the house was spotless were some of her daily tasks. Despite the physical fatigue, Susan felt a certain relief in knowing she could regularly send money to her parents, fulfilling her promise and gradually providing them with a somewhat more dignified life. The interactions with other staff in the house were friendly, though superficial. They saw her as just another newcomer in search of a better future. Charles, the employer, was a middle-aged man with a tired but warm gaze. He treated his employees with an uncommon respect for someone of his social standing, something that always surprised Susan, who was used to hearing stories of harsh and indifferent bosses. During the time she worked there, she realized that Charles was a man of strong principles but also full of vulnerabilities. He not only kept the promises made to his employees but also entrusted Susan with more than the trivial tasks of the house. In no time, she became a trusted figure for Charles, someone he could talk to in moments of loneliness. And those moments were not few. On a quiet afternoon, while Susan was tidying the living room, Charles entered with a thoughtful expression. He approached the armchair and, instead of his usual reserved silence, began to speak. "Ryan will be back soon, Susan," he said, his voice low and filled with mixed feelings. "He's been in Europe for so long, studying. I think he might have changed, matured, but I can't be sure." Susan stopped what she was doing and turned to Charles, noticing his worried expression. "You must be happy about his return," she replied, trying to be sympathetic. Charles sighed, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Yes, in a way. But I also feel a certain fear. I won't lie to you, Susan. Ryan isn't easy. I spoiled him too much, you know. I did that because I thought I was compensating for his mother's absence, my absence too, because of work. I wanted to give him everything I didn't have, but maybe I gave him more than he needed." Susan, interested and sympathetic, sat in a nearby chair, showing that she was willing to listen. Charles noticed the gesture and continued, as if he were unloading a long-held secret. The separation from Michelle was complicated. She was a different woman, loved adventures, travel, a life without ties. When Ryan was little, she simply decided she didn't want that life anymore. Just like that, Charles explained, with a bitter smile. One day she left, saying she wanted to explore the world and that motherhood suffocated her. I was left alone with Ryan, and he was just a child. I had no choice but to care for him the best I could. But my way wasn't the best. Susan didn't know much about Charles's past until that moment, so she carefully asked, "And how was it for Ryan, sir? Did he miss her a lot?" Charles closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving painful memories. "He did, yes. And in an intense way. He was very attached to his mother, even though she wasn't exactly affectionate. When she left, Ryan changed. He became more rebellious, more demanding. And I, instead of being firm, gave in. I gave him what he wanted, believing it would fill the void. I thought that if he had everything he desired, he wouldn't miss her so much. But looking back, I see it was a big mistake." Susan nodded, understanding the depth of Charles's regret. "Sometimes we do what we think is best, even without knowing if it really is," she said, trying to comfort him. Charles looked at her, grateful for her understanding. "Exactly, Susan. I didn't want Ryan to feel abandoned, so I worked harder to give him more. But in the end, I also became absent. And what happened? Ryan grew up with the feeling that everything in life was a right, not a privilege." The conversation continued between them, with Charles revealing more details about his relationship with Ryan. "When Ryan was younger, he was a sweet boy, you know. He had a good heart. But as he grew up, he started to have behaviors that worried me. He became demanding and arrogant, as if he thought the whole world was there to serve him. He started to see people as inferior, especially those who were below us socially." Susan looked at Charles with an empathetic gaze. "It must be hard for you to deal with that, especially knowing you tried to do the best for him." Charles nodded sadly. "It's very difficult. And it's something that pains me to admit. I failed as a father, Susan. But I believe that sending him to Europe, maybe he would learn more about the world, meet other cultures and people, and perhaps become more humble. But, honestly, I don't know if that happened." "I hope it did, sir," Susan replied, with a slight smile of hope. "You did what you could with what you had. And maybe now, with him back, you'll have another chance." Charles smiled faintly, but there was still a shadow of concern in his eyes. "Maybe. Maybe this is my last chance to help Ryan understand the true value of people and things. But it will be a challenge. He's coming back in a few days, and honestly, I don't know what to expect." The conversation ended with a heavy sigh from Charles and a silence of understanding from Susan. Ryan's imminent arrival was a source of anticipation for Charles and, at the same time, a new phase for Susan, who was starting to understand better the complexities of that rich and troubled family. This shared connection and trust created a bridge of empathy between Susan and Charles, a relationship that went beyond simple domestic work and began to resemble a silent partnership of mutual understanding. Charles, in turn, felt that he finally had someone to trust with his deepest concerns, even if it was a maid, and perhaps exactly for that reason. The simplicity and sincerity of Susan made her words even more valuable to him. On the morning of Ryan's return, Charles was visibly excited. Susan watched him as he ate his breakfast faster than usual, a slight smile on his lips. His expression was that of a father anxious to see his son after years of absence. He looked at Susan while she set the table and commented, "Today is a big day, Susan." "Ryan is finally coming home," Charles said, with renewed energy in his voice. "I'm happy for you, Mr. Charles," Susan said with a gentle smile, trying to share in his happiness. Charles sighed, his gaze momentarily lost. "You know, it's been a long time since he was here last. I hope the trip did him good. I hope he has matured, understood a little more about the world." "I imagine you must be proud," Susan replied as she picked up the cups. "It's not every day you see a young man with so many opportunities." "Yes, that's true," said Charles, adjusting his suit before leaving. "I just wish for him to be happy, and to find his way back home, one way or another. Please leave the house spotless. I want everything to be perfect for his arrival." "Of course, sir," Susan said, bowing her head in respect. "I'll make sure everything is in order." With that, Charles left for the airport, leaving behind a trail of hope and expectation. Later, when Charles and Ryan arrived, the atmosphere of the house changed instantly. Charles entered first, with Ryan right behind him. The young man was tall, with striking features and a confident posture, carrying an air of superiority that was evident from miles away. Charles, visibly happy, made a point to introduce him to Susan as soon as they crossed the front door. "Susan, this is Ryan, my son. Ryan, this is Susan, our new maid. She has been with us for some time and has been a great help," Charles said proudly while making the introduction. Ryan looked Susan up and down, with a gaze that mixed disdain and indifference. He didn't say a word, only nodded dryly. Susan, embarrassed, tried to maintain her composure and responded with a timid, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Ryan." Ryan, still not responding, turned to his father and coldly said, "Where is my room? I need to rest after the trip." Charles, trying to keep the situation light, replied enthusiastically, "Of course, son. I'll show you the way." At that moment, Susan realized that Ryan didn't like her. The disdain in his gaze was clear, but she was used to this kind of treatment and decided to ignore it, focusing on her tasks. The next day, near the end of the afternoon, the house was quieter. Charles had gone out to deal with work matters, and Susan was in the living room, organizing books on a shelf. Suddenly, Ryan appeared, wearing an expensive t-shirt and a hard expression on his face. He approached slowly and spoke abruptly. "So, you're the maid my dad hired while I was away," Ryan said, with a disdainful tone. "Yes, sir," Susan replied, keeping her head down, trying to avoid confrontation. "You don't need to pretend to be humble with me," Ryan continued, his voice full of contempt. "I know very well what people like you really think." Susan paused for a moment, surprised by Ryan's aggression. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she replied, trying to keep her tone calm. "Oh, you know exactly what I mean," Ryan insisted, stepping forward. "You always come from places where you're not welcome, always trying to blend in where you don't belong." Susan felt a knot in her throat, but remained silent. Ryan continued, now with a sharper tone. "Look at you," he said, his eyes full of disdain. "Dark skin, cheap clothes. Do you think you deserve to be here, in a house like this? People like you only serve to clean the floor, nothing more." Ryan's words were harsh and cutting, but he seemed to be just getting started. "My dad might tolerate your presence, but don't be fooled. You'll never be anything more than that, a maid. And you better know your place, because people like you have no future. By the way, you should be grateful to be here, don't you think? After all, it's not every day that a country maid gets a job in a luxury home." Susan, who until then had maintained her calm, finally spoke, her voice trembling, "I know my place, sir. I'm here just to work and help my family." "Of course you are," Ryan laughed, but it was a joyless laugh. "That's the only place you know, isn't it? Poverty is what defines you, it's what you are. And frankly, it's the only role you will play in this life. And don't fool yourself thinking my education in Europe will change anything. You're still a maid, and you always will be. Your skin color says that for you." The humiliation was intense, and every word from Ryan felt like a knife piercing Susan's dignity. "People like you are born to serve. You'll never match those who truly hold power." At that moment, Susan could no longer hold back the tears that began to fill her eyes. Ryan looked at her with a cruel smile. "Oh, you're crying. What did you expect, better treatment? If you did, then you're more foolish than you seem." Susan tried to compose herself, but the pain of Ryan's words was deep. "I just want to do my job," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Then do it," Ryan finished, still with the same contempt. "And never look at me as if you're someone who has any value. You don't." Charles arrived home earlier from work that day, eager to spend more time with Ryan. In his rush to see him, he parked the car on the street and entered through the back door quietly, hoping to surprise his son. As he walked down the hallway toward the living room, he heard raised voices, one of them clearly Ryan's. Charles frowned, slowing his steps to understand better what was happening. He was surprised to hear Ryan's voice, full of disdain, and approached, curious. As he got closer, Ryan's words became clearer, and Charles began to feel a knot in his stomach when he finally understood the nature of the insults. "You're trash, you know. A filth that shouldn't even be here. What do you think you are? Just because my dad hired you, you think you're someone?" Ryan exclaimed, with a cold, restrained rage. Charles stopped upon hearing that, incredulous. He hid behind the door, listening to more of the conversation before intervening, his face turning red with indignation as Ryan's cruel words continued to come out, as if they were arrows shot to hurt. "Look at you, your dark skin and those poor clothes. You'll never be more than a maid. You'll never be anything but a miserable person who cleans the floor," Ryan continued, his voice full of hatred. "What do you expect from life? To be something more? It's pathetic." Hearing Susan sob quietly, Charles could no longer contain himself. He entered the room with firm steps, his eyes inflamed with rage. The sight of Susan crying hit him like a sharp blade, and his shout was so loud it made Ryan jump. "Ryan! What do you think you're doing?" Ryan turned abruptly, startled to see his father. Charles looked like a storm in flesh and blood, his anger almost palpable. "Dad, I was just..." "Shut up!" Charles roared, the sound of his voice echoing through the room. He quickly approached Ryan, finger pointed, his face twisted in fury. "You dare not say anything. You have nothing to justify this disgusting behavior. Nothing." Ryan tried to speak again, but Charles, in an even louder and more commanding tone, ordered, "Shut up, now." Susan, still crying, was trying to compose herself and stammered, "Mr. Charles, please, it's not necessary." "Yes, it is, Susan," Charles interrupted, his tone gentler but still firm. "It is more than necessary. It's the least decency." He then turned back to Ryan, now with an expression of deep contempt. "How dare you? How do you dare to treat someone like that? Do you have any idea what those words mean? How much they hurt?" Ryan, with his arms crossed and a closed face, tried to defend himself. "She's just a maid, Dad. You're overreacting." Charles couldn't hold back, his face turning even redder. "Overreacting? I've lost my patience with you, Ryan. And that's rare. You have no idea how repugnant you're being. Since when did you become this monster? Since when do you think you're better than anyone because of skin color or social status?" "Dad, I was just..." Ryan tried to speak, but Charles interrupted him again, even louder, "No. There is no just. There is no excuse." He took a step closer to Ryan, almost face to face with him. "You're going to learn a lesson right now, a lesson you should have learned long ago. You're going to kneel and apologize to Susan, right now." Ryan's face turned pale. "I'm not going to kneel before her. That's humiliating." "Oh, it's humiliating?" Charles exclaimed, his voice laden with sarcasm and anger. "Now you know what humiliation is. Do you think it's acceptable to make someone else feel that? Did you enjoy seeing Susan crying, didn't you? You enjoyed doing this, so you're going to know what humiliation is too." Ryan, still in shock, refused, "No, I'm not going to do that, Dad. You can't force me." Charles, with an even harsher voice, shouted, "You kneel right now or you'll never see a cent of mine. You won't have a car, a phone, or a computer. All your luxury clothes. I'll throw them in the trash right now. You're going back to the life you despise so much." Ryan, hesitating, felt cornered. Charles didn't give in for a second, his expression remaining firm and unyielding. "You will kneel, Ryan. And if you don't do it, you can leave this house right now and fend for yourself. This is your last chance." Ryan, defeated and humiliated, fell to his knees, his teeth clenched in hatred. "I'm sorry, Susan," he said, his voice bitter and full of contained anger. "I'm sorry, for everything." Susan, still surprised by the scene, shook her head, saying in a trembling voice, "Mr. Charles, that wasn't necessary." "I didn't want." Charles, however, was determined. "It was necessary, Susan. Ryan needs to understand, once and for all, that he is not superior to anyone. And I refuse to accept that kind of behavior in this house." Ryan, still kneeling, abruptly stood up and looked at Charles with deep hatred. "Do you think this will change anything? This is ridiculous." Charles, in a more controlled but still firm tone, replied, "If you continue like this, Ryan, nothing will change. But one thing is for sure, you will not treat anyone in this house with disdain again. Next time, the consequences will be even worse. Now, go to your room and think about what you did," Charles ordered, pointing to the stairs. "And remember, Ryan, respect is not optional. From today on, either you change, or this house is no longer your home." Ryan threw one last furious look at his father before going upstairs, slamming his bedroom door hard. Charles stood there for a moment, still trying to contain his anger, while Susan, feeling both grateful and scared by the intensity of the confrontation, merely watched in silence. In the following days, Ryan seemed changed. He didn't become a model of kindness, but there was a certain care in his words. The open disdain and insults disappeared, and although forced, the greetings and gestures of respect became more frequent. Susan felt an increasing relief and at the same time a new admiration for Charles. He was not only a fair employer but also a man willing to correct his own mistakes and fight for the dignity of those who deserved it. And so, under the roof of that house, a new chapter began. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Charles knew there would still be challenges, but he was willing to face them, confident that he was on the right path. True change, after all, begins with a first step. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.